complete this worksheet, Shading with Gradation Value Scales, you are going to create a 10-step value scale using charcoal pencils and regular number 2 pencils and colored pencils in each one of these different sections here. So we're going to start by looking at the sample for comparison. Because the copier didn't copy it very well, it's going to appear to be very dark over here in these last two, almost the same. But what you should have is a gradual, slow change from one box to the next. So I'm going to show you how to do that with a number 2 pencil in this first value scale. A value scale is a group of boxes just like this that gradually change from one to the next until you get many different steps or many different types of value in each box. This helps you when you start off doing a drawing, you do this first, and that way you can tell what values your pencil can make. And then when you try to draw an actual drawing, you can compare your value scale with what you're actually drawing, your source image, to see which ones would work the best or which value it matches the most. So we're going to practice our value scales. The first one's going to be in this number 1 box. The number 1, we're not going to do anything, so we're just going to leave that one alone. That's completely white. We're going to only start in the number 2. So this one is going to be the lightest possible value that your pencil can make. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm holding it at the very end here, and I'm just going to let the weight of the pencil fall on the paper so that when I move this back and forth over that area, it's barely leaving a mark. So it does shade it, but it's hardly there at all. I want to make it nice and smooth, so I'm going to go in a couple of different directions. And if I see any streaks, I'm just going to take the tip of my pencil and just move the tip of the pencil over the paper. I don't want to press hard at all. I just want to let the weight of the pencil make the mark. So you can see it's starting to change a little bit from that first box to the second one. And I'm trying to compare it with what I've got up here to make sure that it's the same value or the same shade of light or dark. Now 3, that's kind of a big jump. We're not going to make that big of a jump yet. But in order to do this, I think the right way or the best way, the easiest way, is to go from the lightest value to the darkest value. So I know if this is the lightest mark I can possibly make, I'm going to go all the way to the other end and make the darkest possible marks I can make. So I'm going to trim this so you can see it a little bit better. Take my pencil, and because this is a value scale with a blended gradient, I want to make sure that there's no pencil streaks in this. So I'm going to go in a couple of different directions. This way, up and down, in circles, at an angle. And I want number 10 to be the darkest possible value I can get. I want to try and be careful not to go outside of that square, because that's just good craftsmanship. And I want to make sure that I can maintain that craftsmanship on my project as well. So it's good to practice it here. I'm going to rub over the same surface so much that it almost looks shiny. There's so much graphite on this that it almost looks shiny. Okay? So that would be my number 10. That's the darkest possible value I can get. So now I'm going to go halfway. So I'm going to find halfway between 2 and 10 is about a 6. So in this block, I'm going to try and make one that's about halfway between the lightest and the darkest value, the very medium value that I can do. So I'm just going to start to shade. When you shade, it's better to use a number 2 pencil because you have a larger tip on the end of it, which makes the marks blend together better. If you have a mechanical pencil, it's a little bit more difficult. I'm going to hold the pencil almost sideways to the paper, so I'm not holding it up and down this way. I'm actually holding it more down, so my hand is kind of touching the paper, and I'm making my marks so that that angle is very smooth. I'm going to go in a couple different directions. I'm going to start out not pushing down hard, just trying to get a nice even coat of pencil. I'm trying to get rid of any little streaky lines that are in between my value or my shading. You can turn your paper. You go this way to get up against that edge and keep going all the way down. In the end, if I've done this correctly, I don't want to see any pencil streaks at all. So if I think this is about the most medium sort of value that I can make, again, I'm going to keep shading until I think it's about halfway between there and there. A nice medium value. Now I'm going to go halfway between the number 2 and the number 6 here. So at number 4, I'm going to try to make a value that's about halfway in between here and here. So darker than the 2, but lighter than the 6. So about halfway in between. Again, I'm going to turn my paper and make sure that I get right up against the edges as well, so I don't leave any white spaces. And I'm going to very lightly shade over. So I'm not really pressing harder, I'm just rubbing over the same area with the tip of my pencil to gradually change that darker. It's always easier to shade something darker than it is to try and make it light again once you've shaded it too dark. So again, I'm comparing with my values here and my values there. Now I'm going to go halfway between 2 and 4 to get this one. So I'm going to start off just like I did with my number 2. I'm going to hold the pencil way back here, and I'm going to very lightly start off shading it really light, just like the number 2. So 3 is shaded just like the number 2 to start with. Turn my paper so I can shade in a different direction. And I'm not pressing any harder. I'm still just letting the weight of the pencil make the mark, but I'm going to go over it more. And in doing this, it's going to gradually start to pull that value a little bit darker, slowly. So I'm going to go a different direction, maybe one more time this way. So what I should have when I'm done is white, light value, slightly darker than number 2, so there is a change between this and this value, and there's a slight change between this and this value. Now I'm going to try to fill in the blank here, halfway between 4 and 6. What does 5 look like? So I'm going to start to shade that just like number 4. I'm going to start out trying to make it look like this first, like this one. I don't want any pencil streaks in there, so I'm going to try and shade it from a couple different directions using the side of my pencil. And if you get outside of the box a little bit, just clean it up with the eraser. So I've got it to look exactly like number 4. It's pretty close right there. So I'm very carefully going to pull this slightly darker. Now I notice that these two are really still too close together, so I'm going to pull this slightly darker. Turn my paper, shade it from a different direction. Again, I'm not pressing any harder. I'm still very, very, very lightly rubbing over this surface, but because I'm going over it more, it's going to gradually change that to be slightly darker. So now I'm noticing that my 5 and my 6 are a little too close, so I'm going to pull my 6 slightly darker, but not by much. Go a different direction, smooth out your values. So you notice that the value goes all the way to the edges and the corners of each square, and it gradually creates a step from light to slightly darker, slightly darker, slightly darker, slightly darker. And I can use this sample for comparison for those. So I'm going to keep doing number 6 through 10 in the same way. So I have about halfway in between is the 8. So I'm going to start off with sort of a medium value. I'm going to shade it in multiple directions. Some people think it's easier to shade with a sharp pencil, but really, it's actually easier to shade with a dull pencil because you have a bigger surface area there and it blends together a little bit better. So right now 8 and 6 look pretty close together as far as the same value. So I'm going to start pushing it a little bit darker. Now I'd say that's about halfway. About halfway there, between there and there. They look very similar, but there is a small difference. So I might need to make my 10 darker. Now I'm going to go halfway between 8 and 10. I'm using the side of my pencil to shade, turning it, going at the same area from a different direction. I'm constantly turning and shading. So 9 is going to be almost as dark as 10, but not quite. So I'm at 8, 9, and 10. Now I'm going to do 7, so it's halfway between 6 and 8. Value-wise, I'm going to start shading. And you just continue this process until you get a value that's about halfway through. Now when you stop,
If it looks like, oh, I've got way too much value, goes too dark too fast, then you might need to lighten up some of your lighter values, or you might need to darken in some of your darker values. But in the end, you should have complete, filled in, gradual steps from one value to the next. It's not easy. You have to practice this. You might have to tweak this and work on shading it, or maybe lightening your values or darkening your values until you can get it to where, it's working. So in the end, you should have a value scale that goes from all the way white to all the way as dark as you can get it at the 10. You're going to repeat this process with this value scale. This one you're going to be using a colored pencil. The final one, you're going to be using a charcoal pencil. So look for the tutorials on those two next.